Sustainability can often seem like a depressing catalog of doom and gloom. But although we face serious challenges, a better and more sustainable future is possible. Welcome to Sustainable Planet.
Welcome to this episode of Sustainable Planet. I'm political scientist Kimberly Weir, and my co-host is Jorden, a guy who knows an awful lot about sustainability issues. In our first segment on Steady State and Degrowth, we talked about how these approaches seek to rein in capitalism for a more sustainable way of living. In part two, we're moving on to see where we see evidence of this actually playing out, if we do at all. So, Jorden, did you know that apparently you have a degrowth community in your own backyard in Edmonton?
I mean, I didn't know, but it is not surprising at all. Edmontonians are a weird sort of people. So I'm not going to make too many disparaging comments about my northern neighbor, but I'll give him a lot of credit. I think Edmonton has done a lot on sustainability issues, including doing their own power purchase agreements for renewable energy. I know they actually have some of the most dedicated bike lanes of Canadian cities. So this wasn't surprising, but I hadn't heard of it.
What is the impetus for Edmontonians to be like that? Do you know? Not to put you on the spot, because just because you're Canadian doesn't mean you know everything about all Canadians, eh?
No, so the funny thing here for listeners is that Calgary is 320-ish kilometers south of Edmonton. We are in the same province, and we have been rivals since the founding. They got the capital, we got the railroad, so we're better and had more money. My brother also lives there my entire life. So anybody who knows me in my personal life heard Kimberly ask a question about Edmonton and they cringe. They're like, how many insults are going to come out? No, I think that Edmonton is more of a community kind of city, I guess. So this is non-academic in any way or information. It's just me kind of giving a perception of it. I do think that Edmonton has a bit more of a collectivist attitude compared to other cities, and especially in a province like Alberta. And then they also have a lot of dispersed industrial activity. It's not concentrated in just one quadrant. So I think this also makes the city feel more industrial, which I just think that it also drives you to want to do a little bit more on kind of the built environment. So, but what I'll do is after this episode, actually, I'm going to reach out to one of my colleagues, Jason, who lives in Edmonton and is really big in the sustainability groups there. I know, especially on bike lane and renewable energy. So I can't wait to learn a little bit more about this.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a whole study done on Edmonton and the degrowth theory that we've been talking about and actually putting into practice and addressing some of the issues, perhaps, that you raised in the first episode. And I realized after we recorded that I never actually told people what my opinion was about steady state and degrowth, because for so long I've been not giving my opinion. That are like, but this is the whole point of this podcast, right? Is to finally actually reveal what I think. And so when it comes to steady state and degrowth, though they differ in ways about going about achieving sustainability, they definitely agree that we're headed to hell in a handbasket if we don't make some changes. And so this is why it's so appealing to so many people in terms of, hey, we agree on, I mean, even Jorden and I agreed on these principles, underlying principles. We just disagree on where to go, what happens next. And while I'm an idealist, and I would love to see, way more so than you, I'm sure, when it comes to degrowth, to see this actually dismantle the capitalist system, I'm too skeptical to believe that it could actually happen. I think that human nature is just such that we bridle against this, and also because, not to insult people, but that I don't think it's actually insulting people, that we live in the paradigm that we're in, and it's really hard for us to see outside of the paradigm that we're in and recognize what's actually going on. And we're just sort of pulled, and especially in a hyper-capitalist system where we're just pulled along by, as we talked about last episode too, working too many hours and expected to work more hours and buy more things and own more things and move into a bigger house and buy a bigger car and whatever, more cars. And so, however, I do think that we can take what degrowth has to work with, offer, like you were saying too, what it has to offer in steady state to try to rein in some of these issues with capitalism and the ill effects. And to use the structure it has created to bring about, so dismantle the master's house from within, the tools, using the master's tools to dismantle the house. And so I part with steady state advocates, and I think we need degrowth in global north, but I think that it's not going to happen. So, well, just to recap, I think too, when we talk about steady state, for those people who didn't listen to the last episode, but certainly should, is talking about using government policies to work within the capitalist system to try to balance growth and environmental and welfare concerns, social welfare concerns. Whereas degrowth advocates actually assert that capitalism itself is the problem. And that's what we need to just move away from.
Yeah. I know. I think it's a really good point you raise about being within the system. I had a weird moment with this last year, actually, because I love history and I love looking for other kind of systems. And one thing I think that you see throughout history is take away the stock corporation, which I think is the real kind of big invention. But market-based systems are found most of human history, right? People are bartering something, there's a price. We can even go back to the earliest known currency is seashells. And my favorite fun fact is the reason we have the word salary is from the Roman word salt, because salt was used for Roman soldiers because it was so valuable. And so this has always been when people have always talked about other things other than capitalism, I guess my entire life I had this little like, haha, like what is there? But it was last year I was reading a book on the Inca. And we have very little information about like how their kind of economic system functioned, but we know that it did not use barter. That it was a command system that had abundance and over surplus though, and it was this weird moment of reading about it and my brain being like, whoa, that is so. How could that work? And like those kind of questions. So I do, and going back to what I said in the last one, that's why I really do like ideas like this, because I think that it can poke you to think in a new way, or at least to shore up some of the holes in your current thinking.
And I think that one of the things that's really important about what they have to offer is that there are actually things that are in practice and have been effective and successful, and all do offer some alternatives, although, again, I don't think any of them are going to happen on a macro scale. But one common theme that runs through steady state and degrowth also runs through and was the impetus for the fair trade movement. And we see this also with cooperatives. They recognize that the current neoliberal economic model is just failing us and that we weren't seeing enough cooperation, and what it claimed it was out there to do was not really moving in that direction. So they argue that governments have allowed capitalism to run the world and that we need to put some brakes on these things, right, for the welfare of the people and the planet. And so these alternative approaches to consumption are like try to get us to prompt us, like you were just saying, to question our priorities and what we value. And unfortunately, what we see is most people don't have the time, even if they have the inclination, to be able to do this. But this is where fair trade and talk about fair trade movement is something, and people clearly support cooperatives. So there is some interest out there in these things.
Yeah, and I think that those are, I guess this is like the thing is I think that we can make these changes over a long run by showing the benefits, by individuals making that change, because what we're really talking about here is a cultural shift, right? In a lot of this, and I don't think you get a cultural shift. To quote a politics show that I love very much, politics is downstream of culture, and I don't think that you can flip that and push the culture out from the top. You run into resistance. And the other thing I don't think that like is mentioned is you might then get resistance from people who would be on your side, because you're now arguing over something else, right? It's now shifted to that cultural aspect of it. Although I did want to say I wasn't surprised now, I guess. I mean, I would have said, Kimberly, I would have been more surprised a year ago, now that I've gotten to know you a lot more, that you were, because like I find like idealist Kimberly and like practical like the world there Kimberly, like that's the balance of like where is that going to come out. So I will say a little surprised that like at the breaking point, I guess, there on it.
So yeah, I am very much a big supporter of fair trade, and I like the idea, like I said, of degrowth and so forth. But even with fair trade, which is a wonderful thing, it's been broken down into multiple levels and diluted by corporations because they want a piece of this action. So the original tenets of fair trade have been basically just diluted, and nowadays, not all fair trade labels are created equally. And we should actually do a whole episode just on fair trade for what it means and what it's about for people who aren't really familiar with it. But the basic premise of it is that people get paid fairly for the work that they do. It's not about a set minimum wage. It is not about like making sure that everybody in the world is, and in fact, most countries in the world, when there is any sort of international labor organization push for a set minimum international wage, like $10, where people just like countries just don't want it. They see that as their comparative advantage, having lower wages available for outsourcing and offshoring. And so, but with fair trade, this is something that, again, that underlying principle is basically what sustainability is about: taking care of people so they can take care of the planet and not exploit the resources that they have, but instead help to conserve and preserve them. But then we see corporations who do greenwashing, and they have so-called best practices, and they put out these niche products and these targeted investments, and all of these things purport to support development, sustainable development, but actually they're just protecting the corporation's natural resource and agriculture supply chain access.
Yeah, this one, you're 100% right on everything you said. And this one I feel the most, I guess, conflict about. Because if we're, being completely honest, my work and my like how I've set up my life in the sustainable field actually contributes to this, right? Because as I joke all the time, I got a business degree, not so I would ever work for a company, but I would know how to get them to do what I want. And nothing is worse than when you push, you get them in, and you say, okay, we want you to do this. And I only want you to do the 1% of it, but you have to do it right. And then they're like, oh, we'll go 10%, but we're going to ratchet it down to almost nothing. And then you're left with this like really sour taste, right? Like, because in some ways, it's like, would it have been better if we hadn't have gotten the companies in, even if now that 10% is marginally better, right? But then they're now diluting it. And so I have two big things on this. I do think there should always be, and this is the role of NGOs, I really believe, is there should be a international standard for these things that does not, and when I say these things, I mean for science-based emission reduction targets, for fair trade. We need an organization that doesn't want companies to use it. We need, and what I mean by that is that the more companies you want to get to use your standard, the more you have to weaken your standard so that it can be easily applied to more companies. But then you get further and further away from a true standard. And so I almost see a world where there's the true standard that we need to maintain. And no, they don't care that companies aren't signing up because they're defining what this really is. And then you'll get the kind of middle ground standards. But right now, when we don't have that top one to point to, it actually gets hard to even show why this fair trade standard is bad, but this one is good. And then now people are confused and they're just throwing their hands up. And I think,
and that's exactly what happens because fair trade has lost its meaning, and people can't take the time, don't want to take the time, don't have the time to be able to work out what the best one is and what's what. Then all of fair trade gets a bad name and say, oh, it's not worth my money to do this. When in fact, even the lowest standard is still better. It's still better, even if you don't want to take the time to do the research. If it has fair trade on it, or ethically sourced, or bean to bar, or whatever, bean to cup, or whatever, that's still going to be better because there's still some measure of social justice and environmental welfare in there built in. But it doesn't mean that it's like the Rainforest Alliance standard or the original fair trade movement standard.
So this is where I got to do my plug for probably one of my most controversial sustainability beliefs. And I call it my in defense of greenwashing belief, which is, so to be clear, is a little tongue in cheek because I don't think greenwashing is good. But I also have watched over the last, 10 years of me in this space, but even going back in my earlier years, what was an acceptable sustainability practice for a corporation 15 years ago was switching to recycled paper, 70% better, and changing out for the first wave of LEDs. Those were kind of like the big low-hanging fruit. But you would see companies putting out like advertisements about it, right? And this was our big push. Now, even if I took a coal company, and I mean one that doesn't care from today, they couldn't put out a press release saying we've switched to recycled paper and LEDs, because even the other coal industry would be like, whoa, that's horrible. That is not sustainable, because what we think of as the minimum is ratcheted up so much. So I want to be clear, greenwashing is bad, and when companies do it, they should be called out. But I think the part that we sometimes don't appreciate is how that rising standard of what is allowed as like kind of we let you get away with, as long as that's ratcheting up, we are actually pushing the entire economy to be more and more. And I think part of we see this a bit in some of the decoupling from energy intensity and what's called GDP or carbon emissions. And I know I only have GDP as a measurement for that because we don't have another great one, but I do think we start to have seen in the last 20 years some of this decoupling happening. So yeah.
I was just going to say, I think that a lot of what you're talking about is obviously your area of expertise, or has what you've done a lot of work in anyway, even if you don't consider it your area of expertise. But about when we talk about evidence of steady state and degrowth policies, that's a perfect example when you talk about an environmental policy that has made a difference, even though also it has got like companies in earnest may have really tried to do something greener. And then it's just called greenwashing or blue washing. There are all sorts of washing colors out there that disparage what the work that companies actually, the progress that they actually made, and the not seeing the standard that's being set and ratcheted up. And the same we talked about with the shift to renewables. And we talked about this with circular economy practices. And we've seen now US states have passed laws in every state to push for right to repair laws. And that we see also countries, how about cities? Let's try that one. Congestion charge. I think that what London did, it made a huge difference in the amount of traffic that flows through London. And New York City instituted its congestion relief zone, where again, it tries to discourage people from going in, driving into the city, idling and sitting for hours in traffic by upping the amount of bridge tolls and other fees that they're going to pay for that privilege. And so you want to pay for the privilege to pollute, then you're going to pay for it. And I mean, your job with renewable energy sources, and that's something that these are all things where we did a whole episode on cap and trade. And so the push, what we really need, I think, is that push for shifting from taxes from income and capital, which is actually harder on individuals, to more on extraction and pollution, or at least finding a way in the capitalist system to account for externalities, which I know I can see by the look on your face that you absolutely disagree with some of. But at the same time, I have to say, and this is why I think I'm more of a realist about, or not realist in the political sense, but more rational and realistic about how the world works, in that cities need tax base. And the thing is that they're not going to get, I mean, Smith even talked about how you're not going to get a lot, or not, sorry, well, Smith too, but in the Federalist Papers, the writers were talking about how you can tax farmers as much as you want, but they're only going to be able to give you so much. What you need to tax is imports or exports and control those.
Yeah, no, so my the look on my face was actually just from the shift part of it, because we both agree. So like my first academic work was on carbon taxes. And I've never gotten away from, that first thing you do too much of a deep dive on, and you'll never get past that. So, extraction or pollution taxes are a type of Pigovian fee from an economist in the early 19th century, Pigov, or as they're more commonly called, sin taxes, because people don't like that. The only thing, and I made this point, it was often the idea that we could shift tax burden from income and capital to environmental or to Pigovian fees was actually promoted by the right for a long time before they abandoned that. But when we look into it, it's not sustainable for government revenues, because unless you believe that we will never actually have sustainable development, because your revenue is coming from the environmental damage. So if we actually start driving a sustainable world, that environmental damage shrinks every year, which means that your revenues would be shrinking, or you'd be driving up the fee, but then there's not really an incentive to shift off of it, because why wouldn't we keep it? So that was the look, was me just thinking about on the shifting from it. But I do, where I fully agree is that we need to price externalities, right? And that's how we get to that, which should drive behavior changes, right?
And because Michael and I actually did the episode on cap and trade, you never really got to talk about your thoughts on that. And clearly you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's funny. So my very first paper I looked at was on industrial response to carbon taxes being implemented in a new jurisdiction, and what happens in industry changes from that. And so I like cap and trade, I think, is a great way of getting at a first pass, and easier than putting a direct fee on it. I think that's why you see cap and trade systems in the States, right? Because, and this is where I will cheekily poke back at the degrowth side of things, is a cap and trade system only stops bad growth. Because technically, I'm not limited. There's nothing that says I can only produce 100 barrels of oil under a cap and trade system. What it says is I can only produce X amount of emissions. If I can figure out a way to produce 500 in those emissions, and I think that's where one of my beliefs is in the kind of innovation. And I always just joke that I don't bet against humans in the long run. Always in the short run, though, right? And I feel like that's my feelings on a lot of this.
Well, it's the same like what we talked about with waste management, right? Those businesses have a humongous incentive. All of the things we talked about, this sustainable practices that they're instituting, because they want to do anything they can to divert usable resources from landfills. If they can make money off of that, if they can save having to be very basically try to figure out how to get not just buy land, but also get permissions for it, city permissions for it, as well as on top of that, paying for all those layers we talked about and all of the management they have to do. So if that's possible, right? And we also did a whole episode on sustainable cities. It's the same thing too. I mean, it's a lot easier if you're building a city from the ground up to say, hey, we're going to make a smart city and we're going to put all these things in place, and great. But most cities are not starting from scratch. And that's the thing with degrowth, is the focus is on the growth that does happen in global north countries really should be on sustainably implementing sustainable infrastructure to replace the stuff that's dated, that is totally just like leaky pipes, just wasting so much water.
Yeah, or just as a great example, the amount of lead pipes that are still in Canada, right? There was a big expose a couple of years ago because municipalities had dealt with their part, but left all of the non-municipal responsibilities. So you actually end up with a large number of houses still on lead pipes because that infrastructure, and we don't think about this, right? And this is where, going back to my kind of two sides on this of agreeing with the problem, not agreeing with the solution. So actually everything we've listed so far, I think you could frame it as a degrowth solution or just as a sustainable development solution, right? And I think this is where it gets back to the framing challenge for me. And I said in the first episode, I think that has had a negative impact because it's captured the conversation. And I think that all of those policies are a little harder to explain to people or sell, is if you're trying to get them to understand degrowth first, rather than framing it as because you mentioned human nature, and I think that that's what we're really running up against. Is I think about it like this. There's a bit of my family story is on my mom's side. My grandpa always liked to talk about how the 4 generations to get me to university, right? His dad working 10 jobs and working since he was 10. My grandpa joining the military at 16 to support his mom, to my mom who got to, went to college, right? And then now 4 generations in, we've got you to go to university. That is such a natural human drive. And I think that when you say, oh, we want to restrict growth or we want to do this, people put it in, it might even have nothing to do with them, but that's how they think about it. So I for all of those policies, I'm like, why don't we just go out and just say, hey, this is a growth policy. That's how I talk about cap and trade. I'm like, this is a growth policy, guys. It's an innovation policy.
Yeah, south of the border, we call that the American dream, right? Pursuing the American dream. And
yeah,
it's the same. I mean, and the thing is that because so much of, as you rightly pointed out, so much of this is cultural. So when we look at social issues, the social improving social welfare is definitely part of the culture, right, perspective of what's going on here. And so I don't think you could ask a person and say, hey, do you want to limit in some, do you want someone to have less income than you? You want to live above and have, do you support income inequality? I guess is the question I'm asking. Like, what person would look you in the face and say, yes, I support income inequality. I am so happy that I make so much more than this person, and let them just be poor. Nobody's going to admit that. And I don't even know that most people, as long as it doesn't affect their income, they're going to be totally okay with it. But when you start talking about raising wages, then if that's going to put a dent in what I'm making, then I'm going to think twice about that.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, the second set of examples you have here are on that social side. And this is where I think that, I made the joke about the culture or politics being downstream of culture. This is when we get into like local food movements and community gardens and healthcare cooperatives, this is where I actually see the most potential and excitement. Because I think that by changing people's experience of these ideas, right, and giving them something tangible, that will start to shift the culture. So I really think that some of these more collective activities that can actually get people engaged in their own kind of sustainable growth, that's going to have the biggest impact in moving us towards something where, because again, you shift the culture a bit, now even the paradigm of the potential solutions that we're proposing shifts, right?
And you see this with microfinance, like the Grammy Bank and so forth, that there is a huge need for banking and access and credit, especially credit for people in developing countries and rural villages, especially, who just don't have access to any of these things. And they do it in a community-based model, though, so that the onus, that it's a shared burden. So that kind of sucks for some people who end up having something happen to them and they can't pay back. And then I'm the one who has to pay, like, to make up because you couldn't make your payment this week, Jorden. And so the cooperative is going to, the microfinance cooperative is going to fail. But the studies have found on this is that ones that are aimed at community projects are the ones that are the most successful, that they have, everybody's got, a vested interest and are getting the benefits from that as well. And so
I was just going to say, and I think that we underestimate how important cooperatives are in our current economic system. Like I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts. I'll do a plug for. It's called Odd Lots. It's a Bloomberg podcast. They do the weirdest economic things. And a couple weeks ago, they had one of America's largest egg producers on. They had to cull 90% of their chickens because of bird flu had just spread so much. And so the next question from the hosts were like, so what's this going to do to your economics? Like, you're defaulting on contracts then, right? Because it's 21 months for them to get back up to full chicken production. And immediately the CEO was like, whoa, don't say that. But because they're part of a chicken egg collective. So yes, they don't have the eggs for their contracts, and they're like a massive chicken producer, but they're a part of a cooperative of egg producers that are at the, like, we're talking economy scale. And so the others are shipping their eggs in. So like they're lowering some of their quotas, and no one contract is getting canceled. And I think that if you went to the average American though and said, do you think that the production of eggs is driven by a cooperative structure? No one would say yes.
No, I think that I can't help but to think about cooperatives and collectivities without thinking about Marx, of course. Like, I should state, I am not a Marxist, but the thing that Marx was concerned about with capitalism and capitalist growth was the breaking down of social connections. And it makes sense. It's very much about individualism and the individual pursuit of more money and better job and so forth. And so when it comes to degrowth and steady state, those model, like, they very much have these same principles underlying them, in that the cooperatives are trying to bring people back together rather than keeping people apart. And this is so important for sustainable development and growth, recognizing that, having a human interest in other people and other people's social welfare. And that's what these things do. They show you, like, why it's important to treat farmers with, that farmers get a livable wage, because otherwise, what's it going to do to the ground? What's it going to do to people who live in that community? What's it going to do to, their practices? And as you were just saying, like, if the egg, would rather. I was hoping that the answer was going to be, well, they're just going to start selling vegan eggs, but that was not the answer.
That was not.
No, but instead, but the reason that that's going to still be able to be successful is because there are other people who are part of that community and collective and are going to fill those gaps. And that's what the whole sort of steady state and degrowth models are really about.
Yeah, and I think I heard something the other day that it was trying to defend capitalism. It was poking at more collectivist models, and the guy was like, well, capitalism does cooperation the best. It's actually done it so well that you don't even know you're cooperating. And he admitted that might be a problem. And the more I think about it, I actually think that really is true. Like capitalism, at least in our current model, we are all really cooperating in ways we don't know, right? Like I am with my landlord, my employer with me, my employer's companies, these networks of thousands of people, but no one sees it. So you get to live your life like you are an isolated individual who isn't relying on these networks. And I think a lot of what the cooperatives do, because even there, using that egg example, they're still selling to the market, they're still a business they're running, but it's surfaced the cooperation. Like it's leveled that up to a point where you have to see it. And I think that starts to see it's a great way of seeing yourself as part of a system again, rather than as something floating kind of isolated out there, which our current system almost gives us the illusion of, right?
That's an interesting way to look at it. I don't know. I'm not sure how much I agree with that. I'll have to check into that.
Yeah, no, it's a new one for me.
I think of it more as like contractual, like we've got this tacit agreement. Well, not even tacit. Tacit in the effect that we've been born into the system and we play by the rules, and less tacit when it comes to like the being evicted because you're not paying your rent. So I don't know. It's interesting.
I want to say I'm fully open. I can't wait for the follow up of critique of this because it's a new one for me too, and I'm just like noodling around on like the framing there. So I'd love any feedback.
Well, we see certainly with community gardens and local food movements and community land trusts and shared community assets, we've seen talking about home ownership and rental equity, where there are people who do cooperate, rural and urban projects and commercial spaces where a bunch of artisans rent out one space and then take turns. We were just in West Virginia in Davis, and there's a cooperative of 26 people, artisans, who each one of them, one day a month, they go in and they work at the shop and they all display their artisan wares there. And that's, really interesting. And it's a great way for people to be able to be creative and not have to take on the whole burden or rely on doing it just through the internet or now through Amazon, because a lot more people, I forget what they always say, like 1/3 of their stuff is all just from local people trying, that they give you that venue. And, good, bad, like pros and cons, listen to the Amazon subscribe and save and what we have to say about that, I guess. But, we have community watch programs also, healthcare cooperatives. There's some really well done ones in Colorado that actually don't just break people's bank because they need healthcare. And certainly the community supported agriculture programs, the CSAs, like we had one, unfortunately, Green Bean Delivery here in Cincinnati was open for 15 years and then COVID killed it off. But another one we've seen too that is getting traction certainly is the ecovillages. Mm-hmm. And they've been around for a bit and there's a wide variety of them. There's one in Peru that looks so cool. Their buildings and so forth that they have. I just sort of stopped off there without.
I was like,
Oh, so you don't have any more thoughts on that? That's okay. I'll talk about eco-villages because one of the, I don't know that it called an eco-village per se, but certainly a sustainable development model was put into play. Frank Lloyd Wright in New York State was meant to be a middle class commuter destination of affordable housing that was all just built in with nature. That's so cool to me. I would love to. Now I'm sure all of them, because they were Frank Lloyd Wright, are priced out beyond any affordability of an average person.
No, I think that is such a cool idea, and I do like, like we've seen it with some of the LEED certificates and stuff. That we did mention certificates getting watered down, so I don't want to put too much on that kind of standard, but. This is, just to admit where I come from on this. I'm super nerdy, so I love fantasy works. And I think one of my favorite things about fantasy is it allows you to critique humanity in an interesting way, both the good and the bad. And I've always been enamored by any book that has elves in it, has elves build and grow with the environment.
Are they
And
exploited?
well, no, but this is the thing is that if they're in most books, no, right? So it's like they don't harvest trees, but all their buildings are built of trees or moved around, or in like, think about like old willow kind of like fences, right? And so they have magic, so it doesn't work. But I guess I've always been a person who like I think that just sometimes seeing the idea lets you change how you think about it. So that's why I love seeing some of these small, like often when I highlight an example in presentations, I'll get a question often, which is, well, that's just one example, or that's so small, what does it matter? And I think we undervalue how much just putting it into the world and showing the world it can be done actually changes things. And so, yes, that one little eco village might not change the world, but if it gets 15 more mayors to think about it, and then from there, they have people who grow up thinking this is possible, like that ripple effect out of that one little village is what excites me.
And there is an entire global eco village network as well that is Gen NL part of a global movement to try to encourage community like citizenship and joint participation and sustainability, social justice, and ecological protections and economic and cultural development without being the focus just on how big your house is, right? And I think these are important things. And I think, as we've talked about many times, like we talk a lot about low hanging fruit and small wins, I think is another one we've sort of added to our vernacular here for like repair cafes, what we talked about with the right to repair, that's important. Public libraries are a really important thing that are worth, I mean, they've been around forever and there's a good reason for that. And so many of them rent out, you can lend out way more than books, since very few people read anymore. But I know we talked about the fair trade movement. Yeah, there are some issues with that. And especially because the other corporations want to get in on the game with that, but there are some like Kwapakoku is the largest they're the largest producer of cocoa beans, cacao in Ghana, and it's a humongous. They're the second biggest cocoa producing exporting country in the world to the Cote d'Ivoire. And so that is a model where it's a democratic organization. I got to visit, which was really cool. Democratic organization. The cooperative manages the earnings so that the guarantee, and this is what fair trade should be about, managing the earnings so that it guarantees farmers an income year round, not just during harvest season. And it also reinvests 10% of all of its earnings into community projects to fund other small cooperative businesses as well. And one requirement is that all children must go to school up to at least 8th grade. But where I visited, not just there, but a few other cooperatives, fair trade cooperatives in Ghana, many of them went on to school after that. And so they really are helping. And many of them are also going back to the community, bringing what they've learned in those tools to help grow the community and improve it. And we've also seen, as we talked about, there have been successful international efforts. And I think this is sort of where, when it comes down to talking about steady state and degrowth movements and where we've seen progress or not in the vein of what it is that they're pushing for, that, we see, I think the biggest failure right now is that retraction from international agreements and IGOs and commitments to international cooperation, because we've seen big things happen that were really important. And now we see some of those being actually dismantled. And so when it comes to these sorts of basic principles, I feel like, do you think they're a little too touchy-feely for too many people, or?
No, because I don't think it's that it's too touchy-feely, because if you take out the kind of steady state and growth, we see these starting and growing in places, right? So I think people can get behind them. I think the problem is when it feels imposed. And as you were kind of going through there, I was reflecting. I knew the end of the episode was coming, and I realized that maybe this is a timing thing in some ways, because you and I. And so I will say you and I have agreed, and with both with each other and degrowthers and Steady State, on the problems, right? Like the analysis of the problem. And then Skip for a second to some of the actual solutions we're seeing in the world, like run through that list, we agree with all of those. They're great. I want to see more of that, right? And I think the middle part of how should it be implemented is where personally I disagree. And I know, and you said that you don't see it happening, so you have no right. And I wonder if it's just a timing thing. Like, I get it's not happening fast enough. I will fully admit that. I think trying to push it from the top down to make it happen faster has a backlash. We see a bad way, but it feels like part of the degrowth argument is like, no, we need to do that because it's not happening fast enough.
But at the same time, the touchy-feely sort of grassrootsy thing is, what I was getting at with that. Like, grassroots efforts just seem like it's so hard to scale them up. We saw, like, I would argue probably fair trade movement is about the most that we've seen of of something that's a grassroots movement that has had worldwide massive appeal.
So more directly answering your question, no, I don't think it's because they're too touchy-feely. I think it's because people are tired and lazy. And I'll put both in there to give, some.
Yeah. Well, I think also just the sort of independence and individualism is just baked into so many people and global North countries as well, that it kind of makes it difficult to go against the grain, even if you really at heart support any of these. I mean, so many people belong to churches still and are community organizers and community involved in their local community. But when push comes to shove, it seems like at the end, it still always comes down to money, unfortunately.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I haven't checked the stat in a while, so I won't give an exact number, but the idea that more people in America are bowling, but there are less bowling leagues.
Bowling alone.
Bowling alone, yeah. I was just going to say that I think it's a sad myth that we've allowed, because no one is an actual isolated individual, and the people who are, and if you've ever been at a point in your life where you feel like you're isolated, it's not good. No one wants it, right? We are social creatures at our core. And so maybe my biggest hope from movements like this is that it does, as I said, surfaces that and lets people see those connections and kind of breaks down maybe I've said on the show before, I always, whenever somebody presents me with a dichotomy, I yell false and run away. Because I actually think that, like, you can't have either or. You cannot have strong individuals without a strong community, because how do you produce strong individuals if you have a broken community? But you can't have a strong community if you don't have strong individuals, because what is that collection? If they're all broken people, that collection will be broken. So, like, that's how I think about it. And I think that we've just gone too far on one narrative.
I think that we should give Robert Putnam credit for the bowling alone, because
Thank you.
Credit where credit is due, right? But also at the start of the episode, I think in terms of winding us up too, is like I mentioned, I didn't give Audre Lorde credit for using the master's tool to disassemble the master's house, dismantle it. And I think that that's where we're at too. Like, we're stuck with capitalism. We're trying to work within the capitalist system. These movements like the fair trade that come up to try to deal with that, then they end up being co-opted, and we're just sort of stuck in this paradigm. And where is this shift going to happen? When is it going to happen? What is it going to take to see that happen? And that's really what we're about with Sustainable Planet and trying to figure these things out. So if you enjoyed our episode of Sustainable Planet, or even if you didn't, and there are lots of things to talk about in these last two, let us know at splanetpod@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You'll find our show notes and all the information you need from resources from today's episode and my Substack post, all on our splanetpod.com website. We'd appreciate if you'd rate and review our episode and our podcast. And thanks for listening, and have a sustainable day.